Hey there, everybody. So after the warp core decided to try and inject itself, my lightsabers got nicked. The package was supposed to arrive today, and I got confirmation that it was on my front porch, which I don't have because I'm in an apartment. And some Sith git came and stole them from me. That's a bummer. Oh well. So, anyway, we are continuing Howl's Moving Castle. We are now in Chapter 7, in which a scarecrow prevents Sophie from leaving the castle. On a particularly bad attack of aches and pain, or only a particularly bad attack of aches and pains prevented Sophie from setting out for market shipping that evening. But the drizzle in Porthaven had got into her bones. She lay in her cubbyhole and ached and worried about Martha. It might not be so bad, she thought. She only had to tell Martha that the suitor she was not sure about was none other than the wizard Howl, and that would scare Martha off. And she would tell Martha that the way to scare Howl off was to announce that she was in love with him, and then perhaps to threaten him with aunts. Sophie was still creaking when she got up the next morning. "Oh, curse that witch of the Waste," she muttered to her stick as she got out, ready to leave. She could hear Howl singing in the bathroom as if he had never had a tantrum in his entire life. She tiptoed to the door as fast as she could hobble. Howl, of course, came out of the bathroom before she reached it. Sophie looked at him sourly. He was all spruce and dashing, scented gently with apple blossom. The sunlight from the window dazzled off his gray and scarlet suit and made a faintly pink halo of his hair. "I think my hair looks rather good in this color," he said. "Do you indeed?" grumped Sophie. "It goes with the suit," said Howl. "You have quite a touch with your needle, don't you? You've given this suit more style somehow." "Huh," said Sophie. Howl stopped with his hand on the knob above the door. "Aches and pains troubling you? Or has something annoyed you?" "Annoyed?" said Sophie. "Why should I be annoyed? Someone only filled the castle with rotten aspic and deafened everyone in Porthaven and scared Calcifer to a cinder and broke a few hundred hearts. Why would that annoy me?" Howl laughed. "I apologize," he said, turning the knob to red down. "The king wants to see me today. I shall probably be kicking my heels in the palace until evening. But I can do something for your rheumatism when I get back. Don't forget to tell Michael I left that spell for him on the bench." He smiled sunnily at Sophie and stepped out among the spires of Kingsbury. "You think that makes it all right," Sophie growled as the door shut. But the smile had mollified her. "If that smile works on me, then it's no wonder poor Martha doesn't know her own mind," she muttered. "I need another log before you go," Calcifer reminded her. Sophie hobbled to drop another log into the grate, then she set off to the door again. But there Michael came running downstairs and snatched the remains of a loaf off the bench as he ran to the door. "You don't mind, do you?" he said in an agitated way. "I'll bring a fresh loaf when I come back. I've got something very urgent to see to today, but I'll be back by evening. If the sea captain calls for his wind spell, it's on the end of the bench, clearly labeled." He turned the doorknob, green downward, and jumped out onto the windy hillside, loaf clutched to his stomach. "See ya!" he shouted as the castle trundled away past him and the door slammed. "Botheration," said Sophie. "Calcifer, how does a person open the door when there's no one inside the castle?" "I'll open it for you, or Michael. Howl does it himself," said Calcifer. So no one would be locked out when Sophie left. She was not at all sure that she would be coming back, but she did not intend to tell that to Calcifer. She gave Michael time to get well on his way to wherever he was going, and set off for the door again. But this time, Calcifer stopped her. "If you're going to be away long," he said, "you might leave some logs where I can reach them." "Can you pick up logs?" Sophie asked, intrigued in spite of her impatience. For answer, Calcifer stretched out blue arm-shaped flame, divided into green finger-like flames at the end. It was not very long, nor did it look particularly strong.
See, I can almost reach the hearth, he said proudly.
Sophie stacked a pile of logs in front of the grate so that Calcifer could at least reach the top one. "You're not to burn them until you've got them in the grate," she warned him, and then she set off for the door yet again. This time somebody knocked on it before she got there. It was one of those days, Sophie thought. It must be the sea captain. She put her hand up to turn the knob blue down. "No, it's the castle door," Calcifer said. "But I'm not sure." Then it was Michael back for some reason, Sophie thought as she opened the door. A turnip face leered at her. She smelled mildew. Against the wide blue sky, a ragged arm ending in the stump of a stick wheeled round and tried to paw at her. It was a scarecrow. It was only made of sticks and rags, but it was alive, and it was trying to come in. "Calcifer!" Sophie screamed. "Make the castle go faster!" The stone blocks round the doorway crunched and grated. The green-brown moorland was suddenly rushing past. The scarecrow's stick arm thumped on the door, and then went scraping along the wall of the castle as the castle left it behind. It wheeled its other arm round and seemed to try to clutch at the stonework. It meant to get into the castle if it could. Sophie slammed the door shut. This, she thought, just showed how stupid it was for an eldest child to try and seek her fortune. That was the scarecrow she had propped in the hedge on her way to the castle. She had made jokes to it. Now, as if her jokes had brought it to evil life, it had followed her all the way here and tried to paw at her face. She ran to the window to see if the thing was still trying to get in the castle. Of course, all she could see was a sunny day in Porthaven, with a dozen sails going up a dozen masts beyond the roofs opposite, and a cloud of seagulls circling in the blue sky. "Well, that's the difficulty of being several places at once," Sophie said to the human skull on the bench. Then, all at once, she discovered the real drawback of being an old woman. Her heart gave a leap and a little stutter, and then seemed to be trying to bang its way out of her chest. It hurt. She shook all over, and her knees trembled. She rather thought she might be dying. It was all she could do to get to the chair by the hearth. She sat there, panting, clutching her chest. And for the record, there is a typo there, and I am especially proud of finding it. "Is something the matter?" Calcifer asked. "Yes, my heart. There was a scarecrow at the door," Sophie gasped. What has a scarecrow got to do with your heart?" Calcifer asked. "It was trying to get in here. It gave me a terrible fright, and my heart—" "Oh, but you wouldn't understand, you silly young demon," Sophie panted. "You haven't got a heart." "Yes, I have," Calcifer said, proudly as he revealed his as proudly as he had revealed his arm. "Down in the glowing part under the logs, and don't call me young. I'm a good million years older than you are. Can I reduce the speed of the castle now?" "Only if the scarecrow's gone," said Sophie. "Has it?" "I can't tell," said Calcifer. "It's not flesh and blood, you see. I told you I couldn't really see outside." Sophie got up and dragged herself to the door again, feeling ill. She opened it slowly and cautiously. Green steppes, rocks, and purple slopes whirled past, making her feel dizzy, but she took a grip on the doorframe and leaned out to look along the wall to the moorland to the moorland that they were leaving behind. The scarecrow was about 50 yards to the rear. It was hopping from clump to heather clump with a sinister sort of valiance, holding its fluttering stick arms at an angle to balance it on the hillside. As Sophie watched, the castle left it further behind. It was slow, but it was still following. She shut the door. "It's still there," she said, "hopping after us. Go faster." "But that upsets all my calculations," Calcifer explained. "I was aiming to circle the hills and get back to where Michael left us in time to pick him up this evening." "Well, then go twice as fast and circle the hills twice, as long as you leave that horrible thing behind," said Sophie. "Oh, what a fuss," Calcifer grumbled. But he increased the castle's speed. Sophie could actually, for the first time, feel it rumbling round her as she sat huddled in her chair and wondered if she was dying. She did not want to die yet before she had talked to Martha. As the day went on, everything in the castle began to jiggle with speed. Bottles clinked, the skull clattered on the bench. Sophie could hear things falling off the shelf in the bathroom and splashing into the bath, where Howl's blue and silver suit was still soaking. She began to feel a little better. She dragged herself to the door again and looked out, with her hair flying in the wind. The ground was streaking past underneath. The hills seemed to be spinning slowly as the castle sped across them. The grinding and rumbling nearly deafened her, and the smoke was puffing out behind in blasts. But the scarecrow was a tiny black dot on a distant slope by then. Next time she looked, it was out of sight entirely.
Good. Then I shall stop for the night, said Calcifer. That was quite a strain.
The rumbling died away. Things stopped jiggling. Calcifer went to sleep in the way that fires do, sinking among the logs until they were rosy cinders, plated with white ash, with only a hint of blue and green deep underneath.
I have a tiny little critter. It is a tiny little spider. Hey there, little buddy. Aw. This teensy little thing. Size of a dot and an eye. Well, here, let me stick you over here where you're going to be safe.
Spiders are friends, not food. But if I left him in the book, he might have gotten squished. The grinding and sorry. The rumbling died away. Things stopped jiggling. Calcifer went to sleep in the way the fires do, sinking among the logs until they were rosy cylinders plated with white ash, with only a hint of blue and green deep underneath. Sophie felt quite spry again by then. She went and fished 6 packets and a bottle out of the slimy water in the bath. The packets were soaked. She did not dare leave them that way after yesterday, so she laid them on the floor and very cautiously sprinkled them with the stuff labeled drying powder. They were dry almost instantly. This was encouraging. Sophie let the water out of the bath and tried drying power, and tried the power on the Howl suit. On Howl's suit. I'm sorry, I've been misreading it. And that's why she wondered if there was supposed to be a D in there. Oh my gosh. I must have paid more attention the first time I read this. That dried too. It was still stained green and rather smaller than it had been, but it cheered Sophie up to find that she could put at least something right. She felt cheerful enough to busy herself getting supper. She bundled everything on the bench into a heap round the skull at one end and began chopping onions. Well, at least your eyes don't water, my friend, she told the skull. Count your blessings. The door sprang open. Sophie nearly cut herself in fright, thinking it was the scarecrow again, but it was Michael. He burst jubilantly in. He dumped a loaf, a pie, and a pink and white striped box on top of the onions. Then he seized Sophie round her skinny waist and danced her round the room. It's all right, he shouted joyfully. Sophie hopped and stumbled to keep out of the way of Michael's boots. Steady, steady, she gasped, giddily trying to hold the knife where it would not cut either of them. What is all right? Letty loves me, Michael shouted, dancing her almost into the bathroom and then almost into the hearth. She's never even seen Howl. It was all a mistake. He spun them both round in the middle of the room. Will you let me go before this knife cuts one of us? Sophie squawked. And perhaps explain a little? Woof! Michael shouted. He whirled Sophie to the chair and dumped her into it, where she sat gasping. Last night, I wish you'd dye his hair blue. I don't mind now. When Howl said Letty had her, I even thought of dyeing him blue myself. You can see the way he talks. I knew he was going to drop this girl, just like all the others, as soon as he'd got her to love him. And when I thought it was my Letty, Anyway, you know he said that there was another fellow, and I thought that was me, so I tore down to Market Shipping today, and it was all right. Howl must be after some other girl with the same name. Letty's never even seen him. Let me get this straight, Sophie said dizzily. We are talking about the Letty Hatter who works in Cesari's pastry shop, are we? Of course we are, Michael said jubilantly. I've loved her ever since she started working there, and I almost couldn't believe it when she said she loved me. She has hundreds of admirers. I wouldn't have been surprised if Howl was one of them. I'm so relieved. I got you a cake from Mrs. Zari's to celebrate. Where do I put it? Oh, there it is. And he thrust the pink and white box at Sophie. Onion fell off it into her lap. How old are you, my child? Sophie asked. 15 last May Day, said Michael. Calcifer sent fireworks up from the castle. Didn't you, Calcifer? Oh, he's asleep. You're probably thinking I'm too young to be engaged. I've still got 3 years of apprenticeship to run, and Letty's got even longer, but we promise one another, and we don't mind waiting. Green flag. Then, Michael was about the right age for Martha, Sophie thought, and she knew by now he was a nice, steady lad with a career as a wizard ahead of him. Oh, bless Martha's heart. When she thought back to that bewildering Mayday, she realized that Michael had been one of that shouting group leaning on the counter in front of Martha, but Howl had been outside in Market Square. Are you sure your Letty was telling the truth about Howl? She asked anxiously. Positive, said Michael. I know when she's lying. She stops twiddling her thumbs. She does too, said Sophie, chuckling. How do you know? Michael asked in surprise. Because she's my my sister's granddaughter, said Sophie, and as a small girl she was not always terribly truthful. But she's quite young, and, well, suppose she changes as she grows. She may not look quite the same in a year or so. Neither will I, said Michael. People our age change all the time. It won't worry us. She'll still be Letty. In a manner of speaking, Sophie thought. But suppose she was telling the truth, she went on anxiously, and she just knew Howl under a false name. Oh, don't worry, I thought of that, said Michael. I described Howl. You must admit, he's pretty recognizable, and she really hadn't seen him or his wretched guitar. I didn't even have to tell her that he doesn't know how to play the thing. She never set eyes on him, and she twiddled her thumbs all the time that she said that she didn't. Oh, that's a relief, Sophie said, lying stiffly back in her chair. And it certainly was a relief about Martha, but it was not much of a relief because Sophie was positive that the only other Letty Hatter in the district was the real one. If there had been another, someone would have to come into the hat shop, or would have come into the hat shop and gossiped about it. It sounded like strong-minded Letty not giving in to Howl. What worried Sophie was that Letty had told Howl her real name. She might not be sure about him, but she liked him enough to trust him with an important secret like that. Oh, don't look so anxious, Michael laughed, leaning on the back of the chair. Have a look at the cake I bought you. Green flag. As Sophie started opening the box, it dawned on her that Michael had gone from seeing her as a natural disaster to actually liking her. She was so pleased and grateful that she decided to tell Michael the whole truth about Letty and Martha, and herself too. It was only fair to let him know that the sort of family that he meant to marry into. The box came open. It was Cesari's most luscious cake, covered in cream and cherries with little curls of chocolate. Oh, said Sophie. The square knob over the door clicked round to red blob down of its own accord, and Howl came in. Oh, what a marvelous cake! My favorite kind, he said. Wherever did you get it? I called in at Cesari's, Michael said in a sheepish, self-conscious way. Sophie looked up at Howl. Something was always going to interrupt her when she decided to say that she was under a spell. Even a wizard, it seemed. Well, it looks worth the walk, Howl said, inspecting the cake. I've heard Cesari's is better than any of the cake shops in Kingsbury. Stupid of me never to have been in the place. And is that a pie I see on the bench? He went over to look. Pie in a bed of raw onions, human skull looking put upon. He picked up the skull and knocked an onion ring out of its eye socket. I see Sophie has been busy again. Couldn't you have restrained her, my friend? The skull yattered its teeth at him, and Howl looked startled and put it down rather hastily. Is something the matter? Michael asked. He seemed to know the signs. "There is," said Howl. "Shall have to find someone to blacken my name to the king." "There's something wrong with the wagon spell," said Michael. "No, it worked perfectly. That's the trouble," Howl said, restlessly twiddling an onion ring on one finger. "The king's trying to pin me down to do something else now. Calcifer, if we're not very careful, he's going to appoint me the royal magician." Calcifer did not answer. Howl roved back to the fireside and realized that Calcifer was asleep. "Wake him up, Michael. I need to consult with him." Michael threw 2 logs on Calcifer and called him. Nothing happened apart from a thin spire of smoke. "Calcifer!" Howl shouted. That did no good either. Howl gave Michael a mystified look and picked up the poker, which was something Sophie had never seen him do before. "Sorry, Calcifer," he said, jabbing under the unburned logs. "Oh, 1 second. My neighbors are wonderful. They are so wonderful. Because, remember what I said, I thought that maybe my lightsabers had gotten stolen. Somebody in the apartment complex has been having their packages stolen, and they actually been putting up signs in front of the door. And my neighbor got home before I did, saw the box and remembered the signs. So he grabbed it, he kept it in his apartment, and he was waiting, and I guess he got home from work or something again. And he kept it safe for me to make sure that it didn't get lost. And I am so incredibly grateful for my neighbors. And the funny thing is, I mean, it's a lovely, wonderful, wonderful couple. It's, I mean, the husband and wife are about my age, but they've got 2-3 kids living with them, including a beautiful little baby. And I'm a sucker for families, so I've baked them a lasagna, some eggplant parmesan, and then I've been trying to learn to bake. And so when I did the brownies, I specifically made some extras for them, and they had specifically asked me if there was anything I could do in return, or anything they could do in return, and some people are just wonderful. Some people are just wonderful. Yes, and some puppies are just wonderful. I am very grateful for my friends. Sorry. Back to the story. I'm so grateful. One thick black cloud of smoke rolled up and stopped. "Go away," Calcifer grunted. "I'm tired." At this, Howl looked thoroughly alarmed. What's wrong with him? I've never known him to be like this before. I think it was the scarecrow, Sophie said. Howl swiveled round on his knees and leveled his glass marble eyes at her. What have you done now? He went on staring while Sophie explained. A scarecrow? He said. Calcifer agreed to speed up the castle because of a scarecrow? My dear Sophie, do please tell me how you bully a fire demon into being that obliging. I would dearly love to know. Oh, I didn't bully him, said Sophie. It gave me a turn, and he was sorry for me. It gave her a turn, and Calcifer was sorry for her. My good Sophie, Calcifer is never sorry for anyone. Anyway, I hope you enjoy raw onions and cold pie for your supper, because you've almost put Calcifer out. There's the cake, Michael said, trying to make peace. The food did seem to improve Howl's temper, although he kept casting anxious looks at the unburning logs on the hearth all the time that they were eating. The pie was good cold, and the onions were quite tasty when Sophie had soaked them in vinegar. The cake was superb. While they were eating it, Michael risked asking Howl what the king had wanted. It looks like the thunderstorm is back. We had a beautiful rainstorm earlier today, although unfortunately I had left the balcony door open so I could listen to the rain, and I'll admit I've never been a fan of thunder. It's freaked me out ever since I was a kid. And for once it didn't... Yep, that's rolling in. For once it didn't bother me, so I left the door open. But it was scaring poor dear baby girl Opal. So I had to grab her blanket and I had to move her fan to give her a little thunder shelter. Because she is a good girl and she deserves it. Anyway, sorry. While they were eating it, Michael risked asking Howl what the king had wanted. Nothing definite yet, Howl said gloomily, but he was sounding me out about his brother, quite ominously. Apparently, they had a good old argument before Prince Justin stormed off, and people were talking. The king obviously wanted me to volunteer to look for his brother, and like a fool I went and said that I didn't think Wizard Suleiman was dead, and that only made matters worse. Why do you want to slither out of looking for the prince? Sophie demanded. Don't you think you can find him? Rude as well as a bully, aren't you? Howl said. He had still not forgiven her about Calcifer. I want to get out of it because I know I can find him, if you must know. Justin was great buddies with Suleiman, and the argument was because he told the king that he was going away to look for him. He didn't think the king should have sent Suleiman to the waste in the first place. Now even you must know that there is a certain lady in the waste who is very bad news. She promised to fry me alive last year, and she sent a curse out after me that I've only just avoided so far because I've had the sense to give her a false name. Sophie was almost awed. You mean you jilted the Witch of the Waste? Howl cut himself another lump of cake, looking sad and honorable. That was not the way to put it. I admit I thought I was fonder of her for a time. She is in some ways a very sad lady, very unloved. Every man in Ingary is scared stiff of her. You ought to know what that feels like, Sophie dear. Sophie's mouth opened in utter indignation. Michael said quickly, Do you think we should move the castle? That's why you invented it, wasn't it? Well, that depends on Calcifer. Howl looked over his shoulder at the barely smoking logs again. I must say, if I think the king and the witch both are after me, I get a craving for planting the castle on a nice frowning rock 1,000 miles away. Michael obviously wished he had not spoken, so if you could see he was thinking that 1,000 miles was a terribly long way from Martha. But what happens to your Letty Hatter, she said to Howl, if you up and move? Well, I expect that we'll be all over by then, Howl said absently. But if I could only think of a way to get the king off my back. I know! He lifted his fork with a melting hunk of cream and cake on it and pointed it at Sophie. You can blacken my name. You can pretend to be my old mother and plead for your blue-eyed boy. He gave Sophie a smile which had no doubt charmed the Witch of the Waste, and possibly Letty too, firing it in along the fork across the cream and straight into Sophie's eyes, dazzlingly. Hey, baby girl. You can lay down if you want to, but I'm still in the middle of story time. I know you're a good girl. Yes, you are very sleepy, and I understand. So you can go ahead and lay down.
I'll be in soon. I love you. Don't cry. Don't cry. I love you so much. I love you so much.
If you can bully Calcifer, the king should give you no trouble at all. Sophie stared through the dazzle and said nothing. This, she thought, was where she slithered out. She was leaving. It was too bad about Calcifer's contract. She'd had enough about Howl. First green slime, then glaring at her for something Calcifer had done quite freely, and now this. Tomorrow, she would slip off to upper folding and tell Letty all about it. Chapter 8, in which Sophie leaves the castle in several directions at once. To Sophie's relief, Calcifer blazed up bright and cheerful the next morning. If she had not had enough of Howl, she would have been almost touched by how glad Howl was to see Calcifer. "I thought she'd done for you, you old ball of gas," Howl said, kneeling at the hearth with his sleeves trailing in the ash. "I was only tired," Calcifer said. "There was some kind of drag on the castle. I've never taken it that fast before." "Well, don't let her make you do it again," said Howl. He stood up gracefully, brushing ash off of his gray and scarlet suit. "Make a start on that spell today, Michael, and if anyone comes from the king, I'm away on urgent private business until tomorrow. I'm going to see Letty, but you needn't tell him that." He picked up his guitar and opened the door with the knob green down onto the wide, cloudy hills. The scarecrow was there again. When Howl opened the door, it pitched sideways across him with its turnip face in his chest. The guitar uttered an awful twing. Sophie gave a faint squawk of terror and hung on to the chair. One of the scarecrow's stick arms was scraping stiffly round to get a purchase on the door. From the way Howl's feet were braced, it was clear that he was being shoved quite hard. There was no doubt that the thing was determined to get into the castle. Calcifer's blue face leaned out of the grate. Michael stood stock still beyond. "There really is a scarecrow," they both said. "Oh, is there? Do tell!" Howl panted. He got one foot up against the doorframe and heaved. The scarecrow flew lumpishly away backwards to land with a light rustle in the heather some yards off. It sprang up instantly and came hopping towards the castle again. Howl hurriedly laid the guitar on the doorstep and jumped down to meet it. "No, you don't, my friend," he said with one hand out. "Go back from where you came from." He walked forward slowly, with his hand still out. The scarecrow retreated a little, hopping slowly and warily backwards. When Howl stopped, the scarecrow stopped, with its one leg planted in the heather and its ragged arms tilting this way and that, like a person sparring for an opening. The rags fluttered on his arms. The rags fluttering on his arms seemed a mad imitation of Howl's sleeves. "So you won't go," Howl said, and the turnip head moved slowly from side to side. "I'm afraid you'll have to," Howl said. "You scare Sophie, and there's no knowing what she'll do when she's scared. Come to think of it, you scare me too." Howl's arms moved heavily as if he was lifting a large weight until they were raised high above his head. He shouted out a strange word, which was half hidden in the crack of sudden thunder, and the scarecrow went soaring away. Up and backward it went, rags fluttering, arms wheeling in protest, up and out and on, until it was a soaring speck in the sky, then a vanishing point in the clouds, and then not to be seen at all. Howl lowered his arms and came back to the doorway, mopping his face on the back of his hand. "I take back my hard words, Sophie," he said, panting. "That thing was alarming. It may have been dragging the castle back all yesterday. It had some of the strongest magic I've ever met. Whatever was it, all that's left of the last person you cleaned... Whatever was it, all that's left of the last person you cleaned for?" Sophie gave a weak little cackle of laughter. Her heart was behaving badly again. Howl realized something was wrong with her. He jumped indoors across his guitar, took hold of her elbow, and sat her in the chair. "Take it easy now." And something happened between Howl and Calcifer then. Sophie felt it, because she was being held by Howl, and Calcifer was still leaning out of the grate. Whatever it was, her heart began to behave properly almost at once. Howl looked at Calcifer, shrugged, and turned away to give Michael a whole lot of instructions about making Sophie keep quiet for the rest of the day. Then he picked up the guitar and left at last. Sophie lay in the chair and pretended to feel twice as ill as she actually did. So she had to let Howl get out of sight. It was a nuisance he was going to upper folding as well, but she would walk so much more slowly that she would arrive around the same time that he started back. The important thing was not to meet him on the way. She watched Michael slyly while he spread out the spell and scratched his head over it. She waited until he dragged the big leather books off the shelves and began making notes in a frantic, depressed sort of way. When he seemed properly absorbed, Sophie muttered several times, "Stuffy in here." Michael took no notice. "Terribly stuffy," Sophie said, getting up and shambling towards the door. "Fresh air." She opened the door and climbed out. Calcifer obligingly stopped the castle dead while she did. Sophie landed in the heather and took a look round to get her bearings. The road over the hills to Upper Folding was a sandy line through the heather just downhill of the castle. Naturally, Calcifer would not make things inconvenient for Howl. Sophie set off towards it. She felt a little sad. She was going to miss Calcifer and Michael. She was almost at the road when there was a shouting behind her. Michael came bounding down the hillside after her, and the tall black castle came bobbling along behind him, shedding anxious puffs of smoke from all four turrets. "What are you doing?" Michael said when he caught up. From the way he looked at her, Sophie could see that he thought the scarecrow had sent her wrong in the head. "Oh, I'm perfectly all right," Sophie said indignantly. "I'm simply going to see my other sister's granddaughter. She's called Letty Hatter, too. Now, do you understand?" "Where does she live?" Michael demanded, as if he thought Sophie might not know. "Upper Folding," said Sophie. "But that's over 10 miles away," Michael said. "I promised Howl I'd make you rest. I can't let you go. I told him I wouldn't let you out of my sight." Sophie did not look very kindly on this. Howl thought she was useful now because he wanted her to see the king. Of course he didn't want her to leave the castle. "Ha!" she said. "Besides," said Michael slowly, grasping the situation, "Howl must have gone to the Upper Folding too." "I'm quite sure he has." "Well, then you're anxious about this girl if she's your great niece," Michael said, arriving at the point at last. "I see. But I can't let you go." "I'm going," said Sophie. "But if Howl sees you there, he'll be furious," Michael went on, working things out. "Because I promised him, he'll be mad at both of us. You ought to rest." Then, when Sophie was almost ready to hit him, he exclaimed, "Wait! There's a pair of 7-league boots in the broom cupboard." He took Sophie by her skinny old wrist and towed her uphill to the waiting castle. She was forced to give little hops in order to not catch her feet in the heather. "But 7 leagues is 21 miles. I'd be halfway to Porthaven in 2 strides. "No, it's 10.5 miles a step," said Michael. "That makes Upper Folding almost exactly. If we each take 1 boot and go together, then I won't be letting you out of my sight, and you won't be doing anything strenuous. And we'll get there before Howl does, so we won't even know where we've been. That solves all of our problems beautifully." Michael was so pleased with himself that Sophie did not have the heart to protest. She shrugged and supposed Michael had better find out about the 2 Lettys before they changed looks again. It was more honest this way, but when Michael fetched the boots from the broom cupboard, Sophie began to have doubts. Up until now, she thought they were 2 leather buckets that had somehow lost their handles, and then got a little squashed. "You're supposed to put your foot in them, shoe and all," Michael explained as he carried the 2 heavy bucket-shaped things to the door. "These are the prototypes of the boots Howl made for the king's army. We managed to get the later ones a little bit lighter and more boot-shaped." He and Sophie sat on the doorstep and each put one foot in a boot. That was extremely Canadian. 1 foot in a boot. "Point yourself towards Upper Folding before you put the boot down," Michael warned her. He and Sophie stood up on the foot which was an ordinary shoe, and carefully swung themselves round to face Upper Folding. "Now, tread," said Michael. Zip! The landscape instantly rushed past them so fast it was only a blur, a gray-green blur for the land and the blue-gray blur for the sky. The wind of their going tore at Sophie's hair and dragged every wrinkle in her face backwards until she thought she would arrive with half her face behind each ear. The rushing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Everything was calm and sunny. They were knee deep in buttercups in the middle of the upper folding village common. A cow nearby stared at them. Beyond it, thatched cottages drowsed under trees. Unfortunately, the bucket-like boot was so heavy that Sophie staggered as she landed. "Don't put that foot down!" Michael yelled too late. There was another zipping blur and more rushing wind. When it stopped, Sophie found herself right down the folding valley, almost into the marsh folding. "Oh, drat," she said, and hopped carefully round on her shoe and tried again. Zip! Blur! And she was back on the upper folding green again, staggering forward with the weight of the boot. She had a glimpse of Michael diving to catch her, and zip! Blur! "Oh, bother!" wailed Sophie. She was up in the hills again. The crooked black shape of the castle was drifting peacefully nearby. Casper was amusing himself, blowing black smoke rings from one turret. It's a pretty good storm they got going there, pup. Here, let me give you your blanket so you can be more comfortable. It's all right. It's all right. I'm here. I know. It can be very scary. But you're a brave little girl, and I'm here with you, okay? I love you. You're a brave little puppy. I love you very much. Calcifer was amusing himself blowing black smoke rings from one turret. Sophie saw that much before her shoe caught in the heather and she stumbled forward again. This time Sophie visited in rapid succession the market square of Market Chipping and the front lawn of a very grand mansion. "Oh, blow!" she cried. "Drat!" One word for each place. And she was off again with her own momentum and another, zip, right down at the end of the valley in a field somewhere. A large red bull raised its ringed nose from the grass and thoughtfully lowered its horns. "I'm just leaving, my good beast," Sophie cried, hopping herself round frantically. Zip, back to the mansion, zip, back to Market Square, zip, there was the castle again. She was getting the hang of it. Zip, there was upper folding, but how did you stop? Zip! "Oh, confound it!" Sophie cried, almost in marsh folding again. This time, she hopped round very carefully and trod with great deliberation. Zip! And, fortunately, the boot landed in a cowpat, and she sat down with a thump. Michael sprinted up before Sophie could move and dragged the boot off her foot. "Oh, thank you," Sophie cried breathlessly. There seemed no reason why I should ever stop. Sophie's heart pounded a bit as they walked across the common to Mrs. Fairfax's house, but only in the way that hearts do when you've done a lot rather quickly. She felt very, very grateful for whatever Howl and Calcifer had done. "Nice place," Michael remarked as he hid the boots in Mrs. Fairfax's hedge. Just because I'm curious how long this chapter is. $147. Oh. 168. Oh, okay. So we got 10 more pages. Sophie agreed. The house was the biggest in the village. It was thatched, with white walls between black beams, and, as Sophie remembered from visiting as a child, you walked up to the porch through a garden crowded with flowers and humming with bees. Over the porch, a honeysuckle and white climbing rose were competing as to which would give the most work to the bees. It was perfect, hot summer morning down here in Upper Folding. Mrs. Fairfax answered the door herself. She was one of those plump, comfortable ladies with swaths of butter-colored hair coiled round her head who made you feel good with life just to look at her. Sophie felt just the tiniest bit envious of Letty. Mrs. Fairfax looked from Sophie to Michael. She'd seen Sophie last a year ago as a girl of 17, and there was no reason for her to recognize her as an old woman of 90. Good morning to you, she said politely. Sophie sighed, and Michael said, This is Letty Hatter's great aunt. I brought her here to see Letty. Oh, I thought the face looked familiar, Mrs. Fairfax exclaimed. There's quite the family likeness. Do come in. Letty's a little bit busy right now, but have some scones and honey while you wait. She opened her door wider. Instantly, a large collie dog squeezed past Mrs. Fairfax's skirts, barged between Sophie and Michael, and ran across the nearest flower bed, snapping off flowers right and left. Your cousin, I suppose. Oh, stop him, Mrs. Fairfax gasped, flying off in pursuit. I don't want him out just now. There was a minute or so of helter-skelter chase in which the dog ran hither and thither, whining in a disturbed way, and Mrs. Fairfax and Sophie ran after the dog, jumping flower beds and getting in each other's way, and Michael ran after Sophie, crying, Stop, you'll make yourself ill! Then the dog set off, loping round one corner of the house. Michael realized that the way to stop Sophie was to stop the dog. He made a crosswise dash through the flower beds, plunged around the house after the dog, and seized it by 2 handfuls of its thick coat just as it reached the orchard at the back. Sophie hobbled up to find Michael pulling the dog away backward and making such strange faces at her that she thought at first that he was ill. But he jerked his head so often towards the orchard that she realized that he was only trying to tell her something. She stuck her face round the corner of the house, expecting to see a swarm of bees. You're covered in bees! Howl was there with Letty. They were in a grove of mossy apple trees in full bloom, with a row of beehives in the distance. Letty sat in a white garden seat. Howl was kneeling on one knee in the grass at her feet, holding one of her hands and looking noble and ardent. Letty was smiling lovingly at him, but the worst of it, as far as Sophie was concerned, was that Letty did not look like Martha at all. She was her own extremely beautiful self. She was wearing a dress of the same kind of pinks and whites as the crowded apple blossoms overhead. Her dark hair trailed in glossy curls over one shoulder, and her eyes shone with devotion for Howl. Sophie brought her head back round the corner and looked with dismay at Michael holding the whining collie dog. He must have had a speed spell with him, Michael whispered, equally dismayed. Mrs. Fairfax caught them up, panting and trying to pin back a loose coil of her buttery hair. Naughty, wicked, bad, evil dog, she said in a fierce whisper to the collie. I'll put a spell on you if you do that once more. The dog blinked and crouched down. Mrs. Fairfax pointed a stern finger. Into the house! Stay in the house! The collie shook himself free of Michael's hands and slunk away round the house again. Thank you so much, Mrs. Fairfax said to Michael as they followed it. He will keep trying to bite Letty's visitor. Inside! She shouted sternly at the front garden as the collie seemed to be thinking of going around the house and getting to the orchard the other way, which is 100% a thing that a dog would do. The dog gave her a woeful look over its shoulder and crawled dismally indoors through the porch. That dog may have the right idea, Sophie said. Mrs. Fairfax, do you know who Letty's visitor is? The wizard Pendragon, or Howl, or whatever he calls himself, she said. But Letty and I don't let on that we know. It amused me when he first turned up, calling himself Sylvester Oak. Because I could see that he'd forgotten me, though I hadn't forgotten him, even though his hair used to be black in his student days. Mrs. Fairfax, by now, had her hands folded in front of her and was standing bolt upright, prepared to talk all day, as Sophie had often seen her do before. He was my old tutor's very last pupil, you know, before she retired. When Mr. Fairfax was alive, he used to like me to transport us both to Kingsbury to see a show from time to time. I can manage too very nicely if I take it slowly, and I always used to drop in on old Mrs. Pensiman while I was there. She likes her old pupils to keep in touch, and one time she introduced this young Howl to us. Oh, she was proud of him. She taught Wizard Suleiman too, you know, and she said that Howl was twice as good. But you know the reputation that Howl has, Michael interrupted. Getting into Mrs. Fairfax's conversation was rather like getting into a turned skipping rope. You had to choose the exact moment, but once you were in, and Mrs. Fairfax turned herself slightly to face Michael. Oh, most of it's talk, mind, she said. Michael opened his mouth to say that it was not, but he was in the skipping rope then, and it went on turning. And I says to Letty, I says, here's your big chance, my love. I knew Howl could teach her 20 times more than I could, for I don't mind telling you, Letty's brains go way beyond mine, and she could end up in the same league as the Witch of the Waste, only in a good way. Letty's a good girl, and I'm fond of her. If Mrs. Pensman was still teaching, I'd have Letty to her tomorrow, but she isn't, so I said, Letty, here's Wizard Howl courting you, and you could do worse than to fall in love with him yourself and let him be your teacher. The pair of you will go far. I don't think Letty was too keen on the idea at first, but she's been softening lately, and today it seems to be going beautifully. Here Mrs. Fairfax paused to beam benevolently at Michael and Sophie. And Sophie dashed into the skipping rope for her turn. But someone told me Letty was fond of someone else, she said. Sorry for him, you mean, said Mrs. Fairfax. She lowered her voice. There's a terrible disability there, she whispered suggestively. And it's asking too much of any girl. I told him so. I'm sorry for him myself. Sophie managed a mystified, oh? But it's a fearsomely strong spell. It's very sad, Mrs. Fairfax wound on. I had to tell him that there's no way someone of my abilities can break anything that's put on him by the Witch of the Waste. Howl might, but of course he can't ask Howl, can he? Here, Michael, who had been looking nervously to the corner of the house in case Howl came round it and discovered them, managed to trample through the skipping rope and stop it by saying, I think we'd better be going. Are you sure you won't come out for a taste of my honey? Asked Mrs. Fairfax. I use it in nearly all of my spells, you know. And she was off again, this time about the magical properties of honey. Michael and Sophie walked purposefully down the path to the gate, and Mrs. Fairfax drifted behind them, talking away and sorrowfully straightening plants that the dog had bent as she talked. Sophie, meanwhile, racked her brains for a way to find out how Mrs. Fairfax knew Letty was Letty without upsetting Michael. Mrs. Fairfax paused to gasp a bit as she heaved a large lupine upright. Sophie took the plunge. Mrs. Fairfax, wasn't it my niece Martha who was supposed to come to you? Oh, naughty girls, Mrs. Fairfax said, smiling and shaking her head as she emerged from the lupin. As if I wouldn't recognize one of my own honey-based spells. But, as I said to her at the time, I'm not one to keep anyone against their will, and I'd always much rather teach someone who wants to learn. Only, I said to her, I'll have no pretense here. You stay as your own self, or not at all. And it's worked out very happily, you see. Are you sure that you won't stay here and ask her yourself? I think we'd better go, Sophie said. We have to get back, Michael added, with another nervous look towards the orchard. He collected the 7-league boots from the hedge and set one down outside the gate for Sophie. And I'm going to hold on to you this time, he said. Mrs. Fairfax leaned over the gate while Sophie inserted her foot. Did it twice. Her foot in the boot. While Sophie inserted her foot in the boot. 7 leaguers, she said. Would you believe I've not seen any of those for years? Very useful things for someone your age, Mrs. I wouldn't mind a pair for myself these days. So it's you Letty inherits her witchcraft from, is it? Not that it necessarily runs in families, but as often as not. Michael took hold of Sophie's arm and pulled. Both boots came down, and the rest of Mrs. Fairfax's talk vanished with the zip and the rush of an air. Next moment, Michael had to brace his feet in order to not collide with the castle. The door was open. Inside, Calcifer was roaring. Porthaven door! Someone's been banging on it ever since you left! And that, O best beloved, is tonight's story. So, I think that the lesson of tonight is that if you go out of your way to be kind and to be loving, especially to neighbors who happen to also be kind and loving in their own way, then occasionally things end up a lot better than you fear. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing anything about you, then I can love you. So, sleep well, dear.